A lonely rancher bought a wounded woman for $2 until she whispered his dead wife's name. The dusty street falls silent. A church bell tolls. The rancher lifts the broken woman into his wagon, never guessing the storm she carries. With her, by the lamplight of his empty home, she stirs and speaks a name only the grave should hold, his wife's name. But how could a stranger know secrets buried with the dead? Railroad men circle like vultures. A sheriff's keys rattle, and whispers spread that the woman is more dangerous than the outlaws themselves. She holds letters that could expose a crime truths the powerful will kill to keep buried. Now this quiet rancher must choose between protecting his land or defending the last living link to his lost love. As hooves thunder and guns cock in the night, one question burns. Will the truth set them free or destroy everything they hold dear? Before we begin, I invite you to take a breath. This space is for the quiet believers, the ones who know small kindnesses can ripple into something greater. Through the flickering lamplight, Mateo Boone's weathered hands trembled as he pressed a cool cloth to the woman's forehead. The kitchen's familiar sense of wood smoke and coffee grounds mingled with the sharp bite of witch hazel he'd used to clean her wounds. His throat tightened at the sight of purple bruises marring her face, stark against skin pale with fever. The mockery of the townsfolk still rang in his ears. Paying for scraps, they'd sneered when he'd stepped forward at the sheriff's steps. But he couldn't have left her there, not with Sheriff Duggan treating her like cattle up for auction, dragging her half-conscious form before the gathered crowd. $2. That's what her life had been worth to them. Mateo's jaw clenched as he remembered counting out the coins, the sheriff's smirk as he'd pocketed them. The woman had barely stirred when Mateo lifted her into his buckboard, her dress torn and dirty, telling its own story of rough handling. Now she lay on his kitchen table, the same table where Martha had rolled out biscuits every morning, where they'd shared quiet suppers and prayers. 3 years of dust had settled on her empty chair. 3 years of silence, broken only by the creak of floorboards and the distant lowing of cattle. Mateo dipped the cloth again in cool water, wringing it out with careful precision. The woman's breathing shallow and quick, her skin burning beneath his touch. He'd seen fever like this before, during the war. Martha had known what to do then, with her gentle hands and knowledge of healing herbs. But Martha was gone, and he was fumbling in the dark with half-remembered remedies. The fire popped and hissed in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Outside, a coyote's lonely call echoed across the range, answered by the soft nickering of horses in the barn. Mateo had grown used to such night sounds, had learned to find comfort in their familiar rhythm. But tonight, they only emphasized the strangeness of having another presence in his home. He reached for the cup of willow bark tea he'd prepared, supporting the woman's head to help her drink. Her cracked lips parted slightly, accepting a few drops. Good. Maybe the tea would help break the fever. Easy now, he murmured, his own voice sounding foreign in the quiet kitchen. How long since he'd spoken to another soul, besides giving orders to his ranch hands? The woman stirred, her fingers plucking weakly at the quilt he'd laid over her. Martha's quilt, with its pattern of morning stars she'd sewn during their first winter together. Mateo pushed away the memory of her sitting by the fire, needle flashing in the lamplight, humming hymns under her breath. Cold, the woman whispered. So faint he almost missed it. So cold. I know, he answered, tucking the quilt more securely around her shoulders. The fever's got to break first. Her head turned restlessly on the makeshift pillow, dark hair tangled across her face. Mateo brushed it back, noting the fine bones of her features beneath the bruising. Young, he thought. Too young to be cast aside like unwanted goods on the sheriff's steps. Then her lips moved again, and the word that escaped them stopped his heart mid-beat. Martha. Mateo's hand froze where it held the cloth. The lamplight seemed to waver, the kitchen's familiar walls pressing in close. Had he heard right? How could this stranger know that name? Martha, she whispered again, clearer this time. Though her eyes remained closed, the cloth dripped forgotten onto the floor as Mateo stared at her face, searching for, what? Some sign that would explain this impossible coincidence. The fire crackled behind him, and he could have sworn he felt a draft of cold air brush past. Though all the windows were sealed against the night, his legs suddenly unsteady, Mateo sank into Martha's chair, the first time he'd sat there since her passing. The woman's fever-mumbled word had cracked something open inside him, something he'd thought long buried beneath years of careful silence. The lamp sputtered, sending shadows dancing across the woman's face. In that shifting light, Mateo sat motionless, watching her labored breathing, his mind spinning with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Outside, the coyote called again, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the ache in his chest. Who was she? How did she know Martha's name? What chain of events had led her to this moment, unconscious and wounded on his kitchen table? The answers lay locked behind her fever-sealed lips, while Mateo could only wait, tending her through the long night ahead, haunted by that whispered name that had shattered his carefully constructed solitude. Dawn crept through the kitchen windows, painting the rough-hewn walls with soft golden light. Elias stirred a pot of oatmeal over the cooking fire, the wooden spoon scraping against cast iron in a steady rhythm. Every few moments, his eyes drifted to the woman Clara. She'd whispered during the night, who now sat propped against pillows in Martha's old rocking chair. The fever had broken some time before sunrise. Her face, though still bruised, had lost its alarming pallor. She watched him with clear eyes now, her hands folded quietly in her lap. The morning light revealed details he'd missed in the darkness. A small scar near her temple, the careful way she held herself, as if expecting hurt. "You should try to eat something," Elias said, spooning oatmeal into a bowl. He'd sweetened it with the last of his honey, remembering how Martha had always insisted sugar helped healing. "Thank you." Clara's voice was stronger now, though still rough at the edges. "You're very kind, Mr. Boone." Elias paused. He hadn't told her his name. She must have read his expression, because she added softly, "Martha spoke of you often." The spoon clattered against the bowl. "You knew my wife?" "At the mission school." Clara's fingers twisted in the quilt covering her lap. "She taught me how to read English. Every morning before classes she'd braid her hair while humming, 'Come, thou fount of every blessing.'" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. She said the third verse was her favorite. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. That had been Martha's hymn, the one she'd sung while working, while rocking on the porch, while tending her garden. The third verse about God's grace finding. The wanderer had brought tears to her eyes every time. "She wore a silver cross," Clara continued, her voice gentle. "Small, with a pearl in the center. Her mother's, she told me." "Stop." Elias gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles white. Nobody knew about that cross. He'd buried it with Martha, tucked against her heart. "How do you—" "The wild roses," Clara said, meeting his gaze. "She planted them by the front step because they reminded her of Kansas. And when you proposed, you gave her your mother's thimble because you couldn't afford a ring." Elias sank into the chair, legs suddenly unable to hold him. Each detail was a key unlocking memories he'd sealed away. Martha's delight at the tiny silver thimble, her patient tending of the roses, the way sunlight had caught her cross during prayer. "There's more." Clara's hands trembled as she spoke. "She wrote to me in those last months. Letters I was meant to receive, but never did. I found them later, after—" She stopped, pain flickering across her face. "They're important, Mr. Boone. She wanted you to know." "Rest," Elias cut in, his voice rough. "You're still weak. The letters, they can wait." He needed air, needed to think. The kitchen walls pressed too close, thick with memories and questions. "I have to ride into town." "For supplies," he added, though his pantry was well stocked. You'll be safe here. Clara nodded, understanding in her eyes. I'll be here when you return. The ride into Ash Creek did little to settle his thoughts. Whispers followed him down the dusty main street. There goes Boone. Heard he bought trouble yesterday. Ain't natural, keeping a strange woman out there. Should have left her to the sheriff's mercy. Elias ignored them, gathering supplies he didn't need. Coffee, sugar, a bolt of muslin. His movements were mechanical, his mind still in his kitchen with Clara and her impossible knowledge of Martha. The sun was low when he finally turned his horse toward home. Golden light spilled from his front windows, an unfamiliar sight after so many dark evenings. Through the open door, he could see Clara sitting by the hearth. She'd managed to dress herself in one of Martha's old calico dresses. Though it hung loose on her frame, in her lap lay a small bundle tied with faded blue ribbon. Letters, he realized, his throat tightening. Martha's last words, carried all this way by this wounded stranger who knew too much. Too much. Clara looked up as his boot heels sounded on the porch. Her fingers curled protectively around the bundle, pressing it close to her heart. The firelight caught tears on her cheeks, but her gaze was steady, certain. They stared at each other across the threshold, the weight of unspoken things hanging between them like smoke. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the gathering dusk, its lonely song echoing across the years of silence that were about to break. The firelight danced across the worn pages as Clara's hands trembled slightly. She smoothed the first letter. Against her lap, the paper soft from age and handling. Elias sat in his chair, hands gripping the armrests, his face shadowed in the flickering light. Dear Elias, Clara began, her voice gentle. The doctor says I haven't much time left, but my heart is at peace knowing you'll read these words someday. Remember how we used to watch the sunset from the porch, counting our blessings? Even now lying here, I count you as my greatest blessing. Elias's breath caught audibly. His knuckles whitened against the wooden chair arms. The Lord gave us such joy in our years together, Clara continued reading. When grief comes, and I know it will, my love, remember that joy. Remember how we danced at the harvest social, how you'd sing off-key just to make me laugh, how proud you were when the first spring wheat pushed through the soil. Tears tracked silently down Elias's weathered cheeks. He made no move to wipe them away. Keep faith, dearest. The same God who brought us together will carry you through the dark days ahead, and when you're ready, this is my deepest prayer, I hope you'll find joy again. Your heart has so much love to give. Clara's voice faltered. She looked up to find Elias with his face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking. Setting the letter aside, she reached for the tin cup of water on the side table, offering it wordlessly. I never knew, he said roughly, accepting the cup. Never knew she'd written, never got to say goodbye proper. She spoke of you often at the mission school, Clara said softly. I taught reading to the younger children while she handled the older students. We'd take our meals together, and she'd tell stories about your courtship, your kindness. Elias looked up sharply. You worked at the mission? Near Apache Wells? Clara nodded, unconsciously touching the fading bruise on her cheek. For 2 seasons, Martha and I shared teaching duties. She trusted me with these letters just before ... She swallowed hard. Before she returned home that last time. The clock on the mantel struck 9, its chime startling them both. Elias stood, clearing his throat. You need rest. I've made up a cot in the parlor, fresh linens, extra quilts if you get cold. Thank you. Clara gathered the letters carefully, retying them with their blue ribbon. You're very kind. Least I can do, he mumbled, showing her to the parlor. For bringing me her words. Dawn arrived with a chorus of roosters and the soft bleating of sheep from the pasture. Clara woke to find Elias already at work in the kitchen, coffee brewing on the stove. Though her body ached, she pushed herself to stand. You should be resting, Elias said when she appeared in the doorway. now wearing one of Martha's old dresses he'd left out for her. "I've rested enough." Clara smoothed her skirts. "Please, let me help with something." Elias studied her for a moment, then nodded toward a basket of corn. "Chickens need feeding, if you're up to it." Together, they stepped into the crisp morning air. Clara scattered corn while Elias checked the coop for eggs. The chickens clucked and pecked around their feet, and Clara smiled at their eager movements. "Martha loved these old hens," she said, tossing another handful. "She used to say they had more personality than half the town council." A low chuckle escaped Elias the first she'd heard from him. "That sounds like her." The simple task felt natural, as if they'd done this together 100 mornings. Clara found herself humming softly one of Martha's favorite hymns as she worked. Elias's movements slowed, listening. They were just turning back toward the house when the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. A cloud of dust rose at the edge of the ranch road, revealing 5 riders approaching at a leisurely pace. Clara's hand flew to her throat. The basket of remaining corn slipped from her fingers, scattering across the dirt. "Railroad men," Elias said, noting their fine clothes and matching bay horses. He glanced at Clara, surprised to see her face had gone. Pale as paper, the riders passed slowly, making no move to turn up the drive. But their eyes lingered on the house, on Clara standing frozen beside Elias. One man in particular distinguished, looking with a neat mustache and expensive hat stared longest, a cold smile playing at his lips. Clara's fingers dug into Elias's arm, though she seemed unaware she'd reached for him. She didn't breathe until the riders disappeared around the bend, their dust settling in the morning air. "You know them?" Elias asked quietly, but Clara had already turned toward the house, her steps unsteady. The peaceful mood of moments before had shattered like glass, leaving only fear in its wake. Elias watched Clara through the window as she paced the porch, her fingers worrying the edge of her shawl. The morning's peace had shattered like a mirror, leaving only sharp edges of fear. He stepped outside, boots heavy on the wooden planks. "Those men troubled you something fierce," he said quietly. "Reckon it's time you told me why." Clara's hands stilled on the shawl. She turned to face him, her face drawn with worry. "If I tell you, I put you at risk too. Your ranch, your life here, it could all be lost." "Truth's got a way of coming out regardless," Elias said, leaning against the porch post. "Best I know what storm's heading this way." Clara sank onto the porch bench, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "I kept records at the mission school. Helped with the correspondence. One evening, I was filing papers when I heard voices in the next room. Railroad Agent Finch, the man with the mustache who rode past today, was there with others, altering documents." She drew a shaky breath. They were changing boundaries on Apache grazing agreements, adding false signatures, backdating papers. The winter grasslands where the Apache keep their ponies through the cold months. They were stealing it all with the stroke of a pen. Elias's jaw tightened. He'd heard whispers of such things, seen good grazing land mysteriously change hands. Overnight, I confronted Agent Finch, Clara continued, touching her healing bruise unconsciously. He struck me, but I managed to flee. I thought I'd find help in town, but Sheriff Duggan, ... She gave a bitter laugh. "He's in their pocket. Marked me as a vagrant, put me up for auction to teach me a lesson." The morning sun climbed higher, casting stark shadows across the porch. Elias pushed away from the post, pacing slowly. His ranch sat on good water, prime grazing land. Standing against the railroad could mean losing everything he'd built. "Without winter grass, those families will suffer," Clara said softly. "Children I taught, elders who welcomed Martha into their homes, they'll watch their ponies starve come. Winter." Something in her voice, the same gentle strength Martha had shown when standing up for others, made Elias's chest tighten. He could almost hear Martha's voice. "The right path ain't always the easy one, love." That evening, coyotes yipped in the distance, their cries echoing across the darkening land. Elias checked the doors and windows twice, knowing the real predators. Walked on two legs and wore polished boots. The railroad had long arms, and men like Agent Finch didn't let go of prey easily. Clara sat in the parlor, Martha's letters spread carefully on her lap. The lamplight caught the silver at her temples, reminding Elias how much she'd endured to bring these words to him. "Would you read another?" he asked, settling into his chair. Clara selected a letter, unfolding it with care. "My dearest Elias," she began. "Today I watched you mending fences in the south pasture, how your shoulders carried the weight of our failing crops, our lost little ones, all the sorrows that have come our way. My heart aches, knowing I'll add to that burden soon." Elias closed his eyes, remembering that time, the drought, the tiny graves, Martha's growing weakness. "But I pray, my love, that you won't let bitterness take root. The Lord gave you such a generous heart, one that sees good in others even when they can't see it themselves. Don't let my passing close that heart. There's still so much love left, and you to give, so much good you can do in this world." Clara's voice wavered slightly. "When I'm gone, remember how we faced things together, with faith, with kindness, with open hearts. And know that somewhere, somehow I'm still watching over you, still praying you'll find joy again." The letter trembled in Clara's hands. Elias sat silent, Martha's words washing over him like summer rain on parched earth. Here was Clara, bringing not just Martha's letters, but her spirit of courage, her willingness to stand against wrong no matter the cost. Could this be the answer to Martha's prayer? Not just the letters, but the woman who'd risked everything to deliver them, who even now fought for justice with the same gentle determination Martha had shown. Elias looked at Clara in the lamplight, seeing past her bruises to the strength beneath. Whatever came next, railroad agents, corrupted sheriffs, the threat of losing his ranch, he knew he couldn't turn away. Martha had taught him that some things were worth the risk. The coyotes called again in the darkness, their voices closer now. But inside the warm circle of lamplight, surrounded by Martha's words and Clara's quiet presence, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the stirring of hope. Morning sunlight painted long shadows across Ash Creek's main street as Elias guided the wagon past the telegraph office. Clara sat beside him, her back straight despite the townsfolk's stares. Her bruises had faded to yellowish marks, but the whispers that followed them were fresh and sharp. "Land sakes, would you look at that?" Mrs. Peterson hissed to her friend. Outside the millinery, Elias Dawson parading around with his auction prize. Clara's fingers tightened on her shawl, but she kept her chin high. Elias noticed how she carried herself with quiet dignity, so like Martha had when facing others' judgment. He pulled the wagon to a stop outside Fuller's Mercantile, helping Clara down with a gentle hand. Inside the store, the floorboards creaked beneath their feet as Clara examined their shopping list. The store owner's wife, Mrs. Fuller, watched them with narrow eyes from behind the counter, her mouth pinched as if she'd bitten into something sour. "We'll need flour, coffee, and some cotton thread," Clara said softly to Elias, trying to ignore the disapproving glances. "Well, if it ain't the vagrant," drawled Tom Wesley, lounging against the seed bins. "Heard tell she cost old Elias $2 whole, mighty steep for damaged goods." Elias's shoulders tensed, but before he could respond, a calm voice cut through the hostile air. "Good morning, Elias, Miss Clara." Reverend Josiah Hawley stood in the doorway, his weathered face kind beneath his broad-brimmed hat. He moved deliberately through the store, placing himself between Clara and her tormentors. "Reverend," Elias nodded, grateful for the preacher's presence. "Miss Clara," Reverend Hawley continued, "I've been hoping to speak with you. We've several orphan children at the church who could benefit from proper schooling. Martha often mentioned your gift for teaching. Would you consider helping with Sunday lessons?" The cruel whispers faltered. Clara's face brightened like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "I would be honored, Reverend. Teaching children has always been my calling." "Begging your pardon, Reverend," Mrs. Fuller interrupted, "but do you think it proper, letting someone of her circumstances near the children?" The Reverend turned slowly, fixing Mrs. Fuller with a gentle but firm gaze. "I judge people by their actions and their hearts, Mrs. Fuller. The good book tells us to welcome the stranger and care for those in need. Miss Clara has shown nothing but grace under cruel treatment." He smiled warmly at Clara. "We'll expect you Sunday after services." "Thank you, Reverend," Clara whispered, eyes shining with unshed tears. They finished their shopping in relative peace, though whispers still followed them. Loading the wagon, Elias noticed Clara stood taller, as if the Reverend's trust had given her new strength. The ride home was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. The afternoon sun turned the prairie grass golden, and a meadowlark song followed them down the dusty road. Clara hummed softly, matching the bird's tune. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Clara insisted on helping with the dishes. Elias watched her move about his kitchen, noticing how she seemed more at ease. When she smiled at some small jest he made, it transformed her whole face, reaching her eyes and dimpling her cheeks. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her, and something warm stirred in his chest at the sight. The dishes done, Clara settled in her usual spot by the hearth. The lamplight cast a gentle glow as she began to sing, her voice clear and sweet in the evening quiet. "Amazing grace, how sweet, the sound that saved a wretch like me." Elias's hand stilled on the leather bridle he was mending. It had been Martha's favorite hymn, the one she'd sung while hanging wash or working in her garden. But where the memory had once brought only pain, tonight it felt different. Clara's voice filled the lonely corners of the house, bringing warmth to places long cold. He watched her in the lamplight, seeing how the flames painted gold in her hair, how her face softened with the music. She was nothing like Martha, where Martha had been sunny and quick to laugh. Clara was quieter, with a deep thoughtfulness born of hardship. Yet there was something familiar in her strength, in her kindness despite all she'd endured. The hymn's last notes faded into the cricket song outside. Clara looked up, catching Elias's gaze, and that smile appeared again, gentle as evening light. Something shifted in the air between them, like the first warm breeze of spring after a long winter. Elias turned back to his work, but the leather felt different under his fingers, as if the world had quietly changed while Clara sang. Martha's words from her letter echoed in his mind. "Don't let my passing close that heart." Perhaps, he thought, she had known something he was only now beginning to understand. Sunday dawned bright and clear, the morning sun casting long shadows across the prairie grass. Clara smoothed her freshly pressed dress, one of Martha's old ones that Elias had stored away as they rode to church in the buckboard. Her fingers worried at the worn fabric, betraying her nerves despite her composed expression. The white-painted church sat proudly against the Colorado sky, its small steeple reaching toward heaven. As Elias helped Clara down from the wagon, whispers rustled through the gathering congregation like wind through dry leaves. Mrs. Peterson's lips pressed into a thin line as she herded her children past. Mr. Fuller, the merchant, pointedly turned his back. Inside, Clara and Elias settled into a back pew. The morning sunlight filtered through simple glass windows, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. A small boy, no more than 6 years old, huddled alone in the corner, his clothes threadbare and his eyes downcast. Clara noticed his trembling shoulders. "That's Tommy Wilson," Elias whispered. "Parents died of fever last winter." Clara's heart squeezed. With gentle movements, she approached the boy, kneeling beside his pew. "Would you like to sit with us, Tommy?" she asked softly. "Sometimes church feels less scary with company." Tommy looked up, his blue eyes wide and wary. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded, slipping his small hand into Clara's. As they settled back beside Elias, the boy pressed close to Clara's side. She wrapped an arm around his thin shoulders, and his trembling slowly eased. Reverend Halley took his place at the pulpit, his kind eyes sweeping over his congregation. His sermon that morning centered on the parable of the Good Samaritan, speaking of mercy shown to strangers and judgment withheld. "Who is our neighbor?" he asked, his gaze settling meaningfully on Elias. "Is it not the one who shows mercy?" "Ah, we not all called to lift up the wounded traveler, regardless of where they come from or what others might say." The words settled over the congregation like a gentle rain. Clara felt some of the hostile stares soften, particularly as Tommy remained curled trustingly against her side. After the service, Clara gathered the children in the churchyard. 7 young faces looked up at her expectantly as she sat on a wooden bench, Tommy still close by her side. She pulled out a slate and chalk, beginning with simple letters. "A is for apple," she explained, drawing the fruit's shape. "B is for brave, which is what you all are, learning your letters." The children giggled, tension melting away as they took turns practicing their alphabet. Storm clouds gathered as evening approached, and Elias and Clara hurried home ahead of the weather. Thunder rolled across the prairie as they shared a simple supper of rabbit stew, the kitchen warm and fragrant with herbs from Martha's old garden. Lightning flickered through the windows, illuminating Clara's face as she set down her spoon. "Elias," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." He looked up, noting the determination in her eyes. "These past weeks you've shown me such kindness," she continued. "You deserve to know the whole truth." She drew a deep breath. "I have documents proof of how the railroad men falsified land claims. They've been stealing Apache grazing lands, violating the treaties. With my testimony and these papers, we could expose their fraud, restore the rightful boundaries." Thunder crashed closer, making the windows rattle. Elias's spoon clinked against his bowl as he set it down. "That's dangerous talk," he said carefully. "Railroad men have long memories and short tempers. I know the risk." Clara's voice was steady despite her trembling hands. "But I've seen the suffering their greed causes. Children going hungry because their families can't graze their ponies on the winter grass. Elders forced to move from lands they've held for generations." She met his eyes. "I have to try to make it right." Elias rubbed his weathered hand across his face. The choice before him was heavy support Clara and risk everything he'd built, or turn away and let injustice stand. Martha's voice seemed to whisper in his memory. "Do what's right, even when it's hard." "I'll think on it," he said finally. "This ain't a decision to make in haste." Clara nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Thank you for hearing me out. That's all I can ask." Later, as Elias lay in his bed listening to the rain drum against the roof, sleep eluded him. The sound of Clara's soft breathing from the parlor carried through the quiet house. His thoughts churned like the storm outside memories of Martha's fierce sense of justice, Clara's gentle strength with Tommy, the sight of railroad men watching his property with calculating eyes. He shifted restlessly, knowing that whatever he decided would change everything. The rain continued its steady rhythm, offering no answers to his troubled mind. Through the next week, dawn found Clara rising early, her strength returning like spring flowers pushing through winter soil. The kitchen, once cold and quiet, now hummed with life as she kneaded dough on the worn wooden counter. The familiar motions brought color to her cheeks and purpose to her movements. "Smells like heaven in here," Elias said one morning, following his nose to fresh-baked bread. Clara smiled, flour dusting her apron as she sliced him a thick piece. Steam rose from the golden crust, and butter melted into the warm crumb. "Martha's recipe," she explained softly. "She taught all us mission teachers how to bake with whatever we had on hand." In the barn, Clara proved just as capable. Her fingers worked nimbly at worn leather straps, mending harnesses that Elias had left neglected. The repetitive task of threading and pulling gave them time to talk, sharing stories of their pasts between the comfortable sounds of horses shuffling in their stalls. "Never thought I'd hear laughing in this old barn again," Elias admitted one afternoon, watching Clara charm his temperamental mare with gentle words and apple slices. "Every creature needs kindness," she replied, stroking the horse's velvet nose, "even the ones that seem bitter at first." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. The next day, Elias led his mare into the corral. "Time you learn to ride proper," he said, adjusting the stirrups for Clara's shorter legs. "Can't have you depending on wagons forever." Clara's eyes sparkled with excitement, though her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the saddle horn. Elias's steady hands guided her foot to the stirrup, supporting her elbow as she swung up. The mare stood patient and still, sensing her rider's uncertainty. "That's it," Elias encouraged, leading them in slow circles. "Let your body move with her, like you're dancing together." As the days passed, Clara's confidence grew. Soon she was posting at a trot, her face glowing with accomplishment. Elias found himself watching her more often than instructing, noticing how the sun caught golden highlights in her hair, how her laugh rang free and clear across the prairie. Evenings brought their own kind of peace. After supper dishes were cleared, they would settle by the hearth with Martha's letters. Clara's voice was gentle as she read Martha's words, bringing them to life in the flickering lamplight. "My dearest Elias," one letter began, "spring has come to the mission, and with it, hope blooms anew. I pray that when I'm gone, you won't lock your heart away in winter. God gives us seasons of joy, even after the deepest sorrows." Elias's throat tightened at the words. He looked across at Clara, remembering how empty the house had felt before she arrived. Now music drifted through the rooms again, hymns hummed, while kneading bread or hanging laundry. The walls seemed to breathe easier, as if the home itself was awakening from a long slumber. One clear evening, they sat on the porch after chores, watching stars pierce the darkening sky one by one. The air was sweet with prairie grass and distant sage. Clara's shoulder brushed against Elias's as she pointed out constellations she'd learned from her Apache students. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. "For everything. Most men would have left me at those sheriff steps." "Weren't nothing," Elias mumbled, but his heart quickened as their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them, delicate as a butterfly's wing and just as precious. For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. Clara broke the gaze first, her fingers twisting in her lap. "I should remind you," she said carefully, "that my past, the railroad men, they won't forget what I know, what I've seen." She swallowed hard. "Being kind to me could bring trouble to your door." Elias was quiet for a long moment, studying the familiar silhouette of his barn against the star-strewn sky. The same barn where Martha had once hung lanterns to guide him home on late nights. Where Clara now mended his harnesses and sang to his horses. "Reckon some trouble's worth facing," he said finally. "Martha always said doing right ain't supposed to be easy." Clara's answering smile was bright enough to rival the stars overhead, though shadows of worry still lingered in her eyes. They sat together in comfortable silence as night settled fully over the ranch, each lost in thoughts of what tomorrow might bring. The decision settled over Elias like morning dew on prairie grass. He found Clara in the kitchen, her hands busy with breakfast preparations as sunlight streamed through the window. "We're taking those letters to Pueblo," he said firmly. "To the territorial judge." Clara's hands stilled on the bread knife. "Are you certain?" Her voice trembled slightly. "The railroad men got no right to steal land or hurt good folks," Elias finished. "Martha wouldn't have stayed quiet." "Neither should we." They spent the morning gathering supplies, moving with quiet purpose. Elias packed heavy blankets, dried beef, and hardtack while Clara filled canteens and wrapped bread in clean cloth. The familiar motions of preparation helped steady their nerves. "Best take the covered wagon," Elias said, leading Clara to the barn. "More protection from sun and rain." He checked each wheel carefully, testing the spokes and axles. Clara watched him work, clutching Martha's letters close to her heart. By afternoon, they drove into town to speak with Reverend Hawley. The preacher's small study smelled of leather-bound books and lamp oil. Dust motes danced in shafts of light from the window. As they explained their plan, "Someone needs to know where we've gone," Elias explained, his hat in his hands. "In case... He couldn't finish the thought. The Reverend's weathered face grew solemn. "The Lord's work often requires courage," he said, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder. "I'll pray for your safe return." "Thank you for believing in me," Clara whispered, embracing the old preacher, when no one else would. Back at the ranch, they worked until sunset, securing supplies and checking harnesses. The horses sensed the tension, shifting restlessly in their traces. As night fell, they shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, both too anxious to eat much. After the dishes were cleared, Clara knelt by the hearth. The firelight cast dancing shadows on her face as she folded her hands. "Dear Lord," she began softly, "watch over us on this journey. But most of all, protect Elias," her voice caught. "If harm should come to me, please keep him safe. He opened his home when I had nothing, showed kindness when others turned away." Elias stood frozen by her words, something breaking loose inside his chest. Without thinking, he crossed the room and knelt beside her, taking her trembling hand in his calloused one. "Haven't prayed proper since Martha passed," he admitted roughly. "Felt like God stopped listening." Clara's fingers tightened around his. "He never stopped," she whispered. "He sent me to you, didn't he?" Tears pricked at Elias's eyes as the truth of her words sank in. Together, they bowed their heads in the firelight, their joined hands forming a bridge between past grief and future hope. They rose before dawn the next morning, moving quietly through familiar chores one last time. Stars still glittered overhead as Elias hitched the team, checking each buckle with extra care. Clara secured the precious letters in an oilskin pouch, tucking it safely beneath her skirts. The eastern sky was just beginning to pale when they climbed onto the wagon seat. Elias clicked his tongue, and the horses moved forward, wheels creaking against the packed earth of the yard. Neither spoke as they passed through the gate, both watching the ranch house grow smaller behind them. The rising sun painted the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Tall grass rippled like waves in the morning breeze, stretching endless and empty in all directions. Clara sat straight beside Elias, her face set with determination despite the fear he knew she carried. "Reckon it's about 3 days to Pueblo," Elias said, breaking the silence, "if the weather holds." Clara nodded, adjusting her bonnet against the growing light. 3 days to do what's right," she replied softly. "Martha would be proud of you, Elias." He glanced at her, seeing the same quiet strength that had first drawn him to Martha. Both women unafraid to stand for truth, no matter the cost. The wagon rolled steadily onward, its wheels marking time across the vast Colorado prairie stretched wide before them. The wagon wheels turned steadily across the prairie, marking time like the slow drift of clouds overhead. Clara and Elias settled into an easy rhythm, sharing quiet meals and taking turns driving the team. They passed scattered homesteads where thin wisps of smoke rose from chimneys, and cattle grazed behind rough-hewn fences. At midday, they came to the first creek crossing. Elias guided the horses carefully through the shallow water, the wagon wheels splashing softly. Clara held tight to the seat, watching silver minnows dart away from the horses' hooves. Martha loved water crossings, she said softly. Said it reminded her of baptism, washing everything clean and new. Elias nodded, his throat tight with memory. As evening approached, they made camp beneath a stand of cottonwoods. The leaves whispered overhead, silver green in the fading light. Elias tended the horses while Clara built a small fire, its warmth welcome as the prairie air cooled. They sat close to the flames, sharing a simple supper of beans and journey bread. Stars began to prick through the darkening sky, countless as grass stems on the prairie. The familiar night sounds rose around them, crickets chirping, an owl's distant call, the occasional stamp of the hobbled horses. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter and stared into the fire. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly. "About Martha's last letter, the one I haven't shown you yet." Elias set down his tin cup, waiting. "She wrote it when she knew she was dying," Clara continued, her voice gentle. "She said her greatest prayer wasn't for herself, but for you. She prayed you'd find joy again, Elias. Even if ... Clara's voice caught. "Even if it wasn't with her." The words hung in the fire-lit air between them. Elias felt tears spring to his eyes, hot and unexpected. Martha's love reached across time to touch him, giving permission he hadn't known he needed. Unable to speak, he spread his blanket near Clara's, closer than previous nights. The gesture said what his voice couldn't, that Martha's prayer was being answered. Slowly and surely as sunrise. They settled down to sleep beneath the cottonwoods, the fire burning low. The night wrapped around them like a familiar quilt, and, for the first time since Martha's death, Elias felt truly at peace. Dawn broke clear and cool. They were making good time toward Pueblo, just passing the outskirts of Ash Creek, when Elias spotted dust on the horizon. Riders approached fast, their horses' hooves drumming against the prairie earth. "Clara," he said sharply, recognizing the glint of badges, "get behind me." She had just enough time to slip from the wagon seat before Sheriff Duggan and 3 deputies surrounded them, guns drawn. Well, Duggan drawled, his face hard beneath his badge. "Looks like our vagrant troublemaker found herself a protector." Elias stepped forward, shielding Clara. "She's done nothing wrong. That so?" Duggan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We got witnesses say different. Say she's been spreading lies about certain business dealings. That's fraud, friend. Serious charge." 2. Deputies dismounted, moving toward Clara. Elias tried to block their path, but Duggan's gun stayed steady on him. "Don't make this worse than it is, Boone," the sheriff warned. "Step aside." "No," Clara spoke up, her voice stronger than Elias expected. "The only fraud here is what the railroad's doing to the Apache people. I saw the forged documents myself. Dangerous." "Accusations," Duggan said coldly, "could be called perjury." "That's a hanging offense." The deputies seized Clara's arms. She struggled briefly, then went still, her eyes meeting Elias's with desperate intensity. "Let her go," Elias growled, starting forward. Duggan's horse shifted closer, the sheriff's gun now inches from Elias's chest. "Think careful, Boone. That's a mighty fine ranch you got. Be a shame if legal troubles came your way. Tax problems. Water rights disputes. Quotes. He smiled thinly. Lots can go wrong for a man who doesn't mind his own business." Elias stood helpless as the deputies dragged Clara to a waiting horse. Her face was pale but determined, chin held high despite her fear. "Keep your mouth shut about what you think you know," Duggan called to her, "or that noose'll fit just fine." He turned back to Elias. "Same goes for you, friend. Some things are better left unsaid." They rode away with Clara between them, her skirts fluttering in the prairie wind. Elias watched until they disappeared into the dust, his hands clenched into useless fists at his sides. The wagon stood empty behind him, Martha's letters still hidden in Clara's oilskin pouch. The truth they carried now as dangerous as a loaded gun. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the prairie grass to gold. But Elias felt nothing but cold. The woman who had brought light back to his world was gone, taken by men who twisted the law to serve greed. He stood alone on the road to Pueblo, torn between the safety of silence and the courage to speak truth, just as Clara had been. The wagon. Wheels creaked beneath Elias as he drove home alone, each turn marking the growing distance between him and Clara. The prairie stretched empty around him, the familiar landscape now as hollow as his heart. Even the horses seemed to sense his despair, their heads hanging low as they plodded along the dusty trail. When he finally reached the ranch, the sight of his house brought no comfort. The windows stared back at him like dark, empty eyes. Inside, Clara's absence filled every corner. Her half-finished mending still lay in the basket by her chair. The smell of her morning bread lingered faintly in the kitchen. Elias moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching nothing, changing nothing. He couldn't bear to disturb the traces she'd left behind. That first night, he didn't even light a lamp, just sat in the darkness until exhaustion drove him to his bed. Dawn came anyway, caring nothing for his grief. Elias forced himself outside, throwing his body into hard labor. The fence line needed mending. He'd been meaning to fix it for weeks. His hands worked mechanically, hammering nails and stretching wire until his muscles burned. The physical pain was almost welcome, easier to bear than the ache in his chest. The second day found him at the woodpile, swinging his axe with fierce determination. Each blow sent chips flying, the sharp crack of splitting wood echoing across the yard. He worked until his arms trembled and sweat soaked his shirt, though the air held autumn's chill. The mindless work couldn't fill the silence that pressed in around him. That evening, his hands raw from labor, Elias sat at the kitchen table where he and Clara had shared so many meals. The bundle of Martha's letters lay before him, untouched. Since Clara's arrest, he reached for them, then drew back. Without Clara's voice bringing the words to life, they seemed cold somehow, like pressed flowers that had lost their color. But on the third night, something changed. Maybe it was the way the lamplight caught the edge of the letters, or maybe it was simply that grief had worn him down enough to let courage seep through. His fingers found an envelope he hadn't noticed before, sealed and unopened. Martha's final letter. His hand shook as he broke the seal. The paper was thick, good writing stock that Martha had saved for special occasions. Her handwriting flowed across the page, steady and sure, even though she must have been weak when she wrote it. "My dearest Elias," he read aloud, his voice rough. "From disuse. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're facing the hard path of going on without me. I know you, my love. I know how you'll want to shut yourself away, to wrap your grief around you like armor." Elias had to stop, pressing his knuckles against his mouth. She had known him so well. But that's not what God intends for us, Martha's. Words continued. We're meant to live with courage and mercy, to keep our hearts open even when it hurts. So I'm asking you, my dearest one, let love find you, even after me. Don't turn away from joy when it comes knocking. That's my final prayer for you. Tears fell onto the paper, making the ink run. Elias didn't try to stop them. All the emotion he'd been holding back these past days broke free at last. He wept for Martha, for the years without her, for Clara in her jail cell, and for his own cowardice in not defending her. When the storm of grief passed, something new took its place. Strength flowed into him, born of Martha's wisdom and Clara's courage. He couldn't let fear of the railroad men keep him silent. He couldn't abandon Clara to face their justice alone. Rising from the table, Elias looked around the kitchen. The emptiness felt different, now not an end, but a beginning. Martha's letter had shown him the way forward. There was no choice, really. Not if he wanted to honor both women who had blessed his life with their love. He would fight for Clara, whatever the cost. He would stand against the railroad's greed and the sheriff's corruption. Not just for her, but for the Apache families losing their grazing lands, for Martha's memory, and for his own soul's sake. Elias stood at the window, watching night settle over his land. The stars emerged one by one, bright and steady as truth. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight he had found his courage again, wrapped in the pages of Martha's last letter. Her final gift to him had been permission to love again, and the strength to stand up for that love. He carefully folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. There would be no more hiding behind fences and woodpiles. The time had come to act. The eastern sky was barely tinged with pink when Elias saddled his horse. His fingers worked quickly in the pre-dawn chill, checking the cinch and adjusting the stirrups with practiced care. The mare shifted beneath his touch, sensing his urgency. Ash Creek lay quiet as Elias rode in, shop windows still dark and streets empty except for a few early risers. The jail squatted at the edge of town, a squat building of rough-hewn logs that seemed to lean away from the morning light. His boots echoed on the wooden sidewalk as he approached. Through the barred window, he caught a glimpse of Clara. She sat on a narrow cot, her dress wrinkled but her spine straight. Even in captivity, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Dark bruises marked her face where the deputies had been rough, but her eyes were clear and steady when they met his. "Reverend Halley said I could see you," Elias said softly, his throat tight. "Just for a few minutes." Clara moved closer to the bars, her fingers wrapping around the iron. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "They'll take your ranch if you stand with me. Please, Elias, protect yourself. I couldn't bear it if you lost everything because of me." Elias reached through the bars, covering her hand with his own. "I lost everything once before," he said. "When Martha died, I thought that was the end of me. But then you came carrying her words, her memory, her hope." He squeezed her fingers gently. "I won't lose you too, not to their lies." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she blinked them back. "Martha always said you were the strongest man she knew. Not just in body, but in spirit. I aim to prove her right," Elias said. "Hold on till Sunday. Trust in the Lord, and in me." When Sunday morning dawned, the church bell rang across Ash Creek, calling the faithful to worship. Townsfolk filed in, filling the wooden pews as sunlight streamed through the high windows. Reverend Halley stood at the pulpit, his kind face solemn as he surveyed his congregation. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "today we have a testimony to hear. Elias Boone has asked to speak to us all." A murmur ran through the crowd as Elias stood. He walked slowly to the front, Martha's worn Bible clutched in his hands. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice came out steady and clear. "Most of you knew my wife Martha," he said. "Knew her as a woman of faith and truth. Before she died, she wrote letters that were entrusted to her dear friend, Clara Dawson." He opened the Bible carefully, drawing out Martha's final letter. The paper crackled in the hushed church as he unfolded it. "This is Martha's last message to me," Elias continued. "But it's also her testimony about Clara and about the work they did together at the mission school." His voice grew stronger as he read Martha's words, describing Clara's dedication to teaching Apache children, her stand against injustice, her unwavering faith. When he looked up, he saw faces changed by understanding. Martha had been beloved in Ash Creek. Her words carried weight even now. "The railroad men who hurt Clara," Elias said, "they did it because she witnessed their crimes. She saw them falsifying documents, stealing land that rightfully belongs to the Apache people under treaty law. The same men who'd strike a woman rather than let her speak truth now want to hang her for telling it." Sheriff Duggan stood up from his pew, his face dark with anger. "That's enough, Boone. You're spreading dangerous lies." "No," Elias cut in, his voice ringing off the church walls. "The lies stop here. Clara has proof. Martha's letters name names, dates, places. The territorial judge will hear it all." He turned to face the congregation fully. "The question is, will you stand with truth? Or will you let fear keep you silent while an innocent woman suffers?" The church fell so quiet you could hear the wind sighing through the eaves. Then old Mrs. Peterson, who had been Martha's closest friend, rose shakily to her feet. "I believe him," she declared. Martha would never have trusted someone who wasn't worthy. One by one, others stood. The mercantile owner, the blacksmith and his wife. Reverend Halley moved to stand beside Elias, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. "We are called to be witnesses to truth," the preacher said firmly, "and to stand against injustice, whatever the cost." Elias watched as more people rose, their faces set with determination. The sheriff backed toward the door, his authority crumbling. In the face of the community's united stand. In that moment, Elias felt Martha's presence as strongly as if she stood beside him. Her final gift had been more than permission to love again. It was the key to unlocking the truth and bringing justice to light. The church erupted into chaos. Shouts and arguments bounced off the wooden walls as neighbors turned to face each other, some defending Clara while others sided with the railroad's interests. Dust motes danced in the shafts of morning light as the congregation divided. "Order, order in the house of God." Reverend Hale's voice cut through the din like thunder. He stood tall at the pulpit, his weathered face stern. "We are called to be seekers of truth, not merchants of lies. The Lord demands justice from his people." The Reverend's words settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. In the quiet that followed, Dr. Wilson's wife stood up, her gray hair catching the sunlight. "My husband treated Martha in her final days," she said clearly. She spoke often of her friend Clara from the mission school. "Everything Elias has said matches what Martha told us." More voices joined in support. The blacksmith's deep rumble carried across the church. "Railroad's been pushing folks around too long. Time somebody stood up to them." Sheriff Dugan's face had turned an ugly shade of red. He opened his mouth to speak, but a commanding voice from the back pews stopped him. "That's quite enough, Sheriff." Judge Harrison rose slowly, his formal black coat stark against the whitewashed walls. The territorial judge had been visiting family in Ash Creek, attending service as he always did when in town. "I've heard sufficient cause to order Miss Dawson's immediate release." "Your Honor," Duggan protested, "the charges were fabricated, unless I miss my guess." The judge's eyes were sharp as steel. "Release her now, Sheriff. Or shall we discuss your own involvement with these railroad matters?" Duggan's shoulders sagged. He fumbled with his keys, the metal jingling as his hands shook. Two deputies hurried out to fetch Clara from the jail. The congregation spilled onto the church steps, waiting in the bright morning air. When Clara appeared, supported between the deputies, a gasp went through the crowd. Her face was pale, her dress dirty from the cell, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Elias rushed forward, gathering her in his arms as the deputies stepped back. She trembled against him, her fingers clutching his Sunday coat. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." "Martha showed me the way," he murmured back. "Through her letters. Through you." The crowd's mood had shifted like wind before a storm. Several men were now glaring at Railroad Agent Finch, who stood sweating at the edge of the gathering. The agent backed away, nearly tripping over his polished boots. "Folks should be careful," Finch called out, his voice thin with fear. "Railroad has a long memory. Contracts can be reconsidered." "Is that a threat, Mr. Finch?" Judge Harrison's voice carried clearly. "Perhaps you'd like to explain those contracts to me, in detail." The agent turned and fled, his coattails flapping as he ran for his horse. The sight of his retreat brought scattered cheers from the crowd. Even Sheriff Duggan looked relieved, as if a weight had lifted from his shoulders. That evening, Elias and Clara sat on his porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. The peaceful moment shattered as gunshots cracked through the twilight. Bullets splintered wood near the barn, sending chickens scattering in panic. Inside, Elias shouted, pulling Clara to safety. They crouched behind the thick walls as more shots rang out, but then came an answering volley, not from the house, but from the road. Voices called out in the gathering dark, "That's far enough, you railroad thugs. Clear off Boone's land." Elias peered carefully through a window. His heart swelled at what he saw. At least a dozen neighbors had gathered, rifles ready. The blacksmith's bulk was unmistakable in the dusk, and beside him stood Reverend Hawley, shotgun held with surprising confidence. Running horses thundered away into the night. When the dust settled, Elias opened his door to find his yard full of townspeople. "Thought you might need some help," the blacksmith said gruffly. "Ain't right, a man standing alone against such as them." "You're not alone anymore, Elias," Reverend Hawley added, propping his shotgun carefully against the porch rail. "None of us are. That's what community means." Clara slipped her hand into Elias's, and he squeezed it gently. The yard filled with lantern light as more neighbors arrived, bringing food and offers of help to guard through the night. Women clustered around Clara, expressing sympathy and support, while men discussed plans to protect the ranch. Looking at the faces gathered in his yard, faces that had previously turned away when he passed on the street, Elias felt a profound shift. These people no longer saw him as the silent widower, the recluse who kept to himself. They saw him as he truly was, a man willing to stand for what was right, no matter the cost. Martha would have been proud of this moment, he thought. Proud of the way truth had brought healing not just to him, but to the whole community. Her letters had built a bridge between past and present, between isolation and belonging. Judge Harrison wasted no time. Within days, he convened a special inquiry at the Ash Creek courthouse, the wooden benches packed with concerned citizens. As evidence mounted of forged documents and violated treaties, Railroad Agent Finch and his cohorts slipped away in the night, leaving only dust and bitter memories behind. Sheriff Duggan stood before the town, his badge gleaming one last time in the morning light. His resignation speech was brief, his voice thick with shame. "I forgot my duty," he admitted, laying his star on the judge's desk. "Chose money over right." He walked out of the courthouse, shoulders bent, a broken man. When the Apache representatives arrived, they carried themselves with quiet dignity. Their spokesman, a tall man with gray-streaked hair, presented ancient maps marking the grazing lands that had been stolen. The judge listened intently, taking careful notes as interpreters helped bridge the language gap. The treaty rights were officially reopened for review, bringing hope for justice long denied. Through it all, Elias and Clara drew strength from each other. They walked together down Ash Creek's dusty Main Street, their joined hands drawing smiles instead of whispers. Now, women who had once turned away stopped to greet Clara warmly. Men tipped their hats to Elias with newfound respect. "Feels different," Clara said softly, squeezing his hand. "Everything's different," Elias replied, thinking how true that was. That evening, their ranch house glowed with warmth and welcome. Reverend Hawley sat at their table, his deep laugh mixing with children's giggles as Clara served fresh baked bread. 3 orphans from the church had come for supper, filling the once silent rooms with life. "Miss Clara," one little girl asked, "will you teach us our letters again tomorrow?" Clara exchanged a thoughtful look with Elias. "You know," she said, "that old barn of yours has such nice light in the afternoon, with some cleaning and simple benches." "A schoolroom," Elias finished, surprising himself with how right it felt. He smiled at Clara, seeing Martha's dream of teaching living on through her. "We could fix it up proper." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Reverend Hawley remarked, watching them both with knowing eyes. "Bringing light from darkness, joy from sorrow." The children chattered excitedly about the barn school plans while Clara served apple pie. Lamplight danced on the walls, and Elias realized his house had become a home again. Autumn painted the Colorado hills in gold and crimson as weeks passed at the Dawson Ranch. The old barn, once silent save for horses, now rang with children's voices. Clara had transformed it beautifully, with help from eager townspeople. Fresh whitewash brightened the walls, and neat rows of simple benches faced a small teaching desk. Sunlight streamed through cleaned windows, falling across slate boards where young hands practiced their letters. Elias worked the near pasture, moving cattle between summer and winter grass. The familiar rhythm of ranch work felt different now, lightened by the sound of children's voices carried on the breeze. He found himself pausing often, leaning on his fence post to listen as Clara led her students in reciting their alphabet. A is for Apache, she would say, smiling at the two dark-eyed children who sat among the others. Their fathers had helped build the benches, bridging old divisions with shared work. B is for brave, C is for community. The lessons went beyond letters and numbers. Clara taught them songs in English and Apache, stories of both people's heroes. When children who once would have been enemies shared cornbread at lunch, Elias saw hope for the future taking root. That evening, as purple dusk settled over the land, Clara set their supper table. Lamplight caught her hair, turning it to spun gold. Steam rose from fresh biscuits and beef stew, filling the kitchen with warmth that went beyond mere heat. Elias reached across the worn tablecloth and clasped her hand. His voice was soft but sure. "Thank you, Clara, for Martha's letters, for having the courage to stand up for what's right, for giving me a second chance at joy." Clara's eyes shimmered with tears as she squeezed his hand. Martha knew what she was doing, she whispered. "Her prayers brought us together." Through the window, stars began to sparkle over the ranch, bright against the deepening blue. The house that had echoed with loneliness now hummed with life and purpose. Elias felt Martha's final prayer answered in full. He was no longer the silent widower, but a man surrounded by family born of faith, mercy, and love. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.